excited to introduce my guest today, four-time Grammy Award-winning producer, musician, and songwriter, Larry Klein. Larry has worked with artists such as Herbie Hancock, Tracy Chapman, Madeleine Perreault, Walter Becker, Luciana Souza, Melody Gardot, Pink, Seal, numerous albums with Joni Mitchell, Robbie Robertson, Bob Dylan, you name it. He's produced the Grammy Award-winning 2007 Album of the Year and Best Contemporary Jazz Album of the Year, River, the Joni Letters, with Herbie Hancock. Previously, he won the Grammy for Best Traditional Pop Vocal Album for Both Sides Now in 2000 and the Grammy for Best Pop Album for Turbulent Indigo in 1995. Larry, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You know, you've had such a tremendous career, and I've really enjoyed looking at your interviews where you talk about your upbringing and where you learned. Let's go back. I want to read a quote that you mentioned about a teacher that you had. Here's the quote. I had a teacher named Wayne Bischoff from grade 7 through high school who was an extraordinary character. He was a clarinetist and a composer who studied with one of Arnold Schoenberg's disciples. He wanted to turn the high school music department into a college-level music program. He was a real Mr. Holland kind of character. Can you talk about what it was like to meet him in grade 7? And were you serious about music at that time?
Yeah, I started playing guitar, I believe, at age 6 or so. And I think that my first motivation to pick the guitar up was hearing one of the early Beatles records, and I thought, well, God, if you can do that with songs, I want to do that. You know, that's what I want to do. And so I started taking guitar lessons of a couple of different types. Actually, I was learning to read with one teacher, and then actually learning sort of more of a folk style of playing guitar from another teacher, and then by the time I think I was around just going into maybe 7th grade or so, I switched from guitar to bass for the standard reason, you know, that most people do. That somebody has to play bass in the band, you know, and so once I picked up a bass, I just absolutely loved it. And so I was playing bass. I was playing a little bit of flute just at school. I played a little bit of viola. I was learning. I was getting a little bit of a foundation on all sorts of different instruments. I was pretty fixated on music from a very early age. And you know, my mom and dad had a great record collection. They were omnivores as far as genre-wise what they listened to, and so I was exposed to everything from Broadway musicals to Wes Montgomery to Sinatra and Nat King Cole. You were raised
in L.A., is that right?
That's right, yeah.
So that's a very, very musical town. Were your parents musical or musicians?
No, not at all. My dad was an aerospace engineer who worked mainly on satellites and space probes, and my mom was a homemaker.
Where did you get that fire from to start guitar at the age of 6?
At the Beatles. That was it. Seeing and hearing the Beatles and what they were doing with a pop song. It communicated so immediately to me, and somehow that conduit from the conduit of reaching your own feelings and emotions through music and words coupled together. Listening to the Beatles sort of established that conduit for me, and once I felt that feeling of things resonating so immediately from a song, that was it. I became completely obsessed with music from that time when I felt that feeling, you know.
Now, how did you learn? Did you have a teacher at 6, or were you kind of teaching yourself?
I had one pretty conventional guitar teacher who taught me out of books, and he was sort of a somewhat comical character in that he'd fall asleep during lessons, and very conventional guy, very conventional teacher, and so I learned to read music first from him, and then at the same time I was taking guitar lessons with a woman who kind of taught folk style guitar and taught me to start playing songs and whatever Judy Collins' latest record was, or different, more down that folk tradition.
So grade 7 in the U.S., is that about 12 years old?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, so in those 5 years, were you in any band, or was it pretty much just with a teacher and cultivating that development?
No. I started playing in little bands, playing blues stuff and different covers of different things. I think from the time I was maybe 11 or so.
Do you have perfect pitch, Larry?
No, I do not. I have good relative pitch, but not perfect pitch. I can't just pick out of the air, pick notes out of the air.
Did you train your ear at a young age? Did you pick out things on your own by ear, or were you reading sheet music from the beginning?
I started out picking things up by ear. And then I guess right at the very beginning, I started taking guitar lessons and learning out of a series of books called the Alfred Method, and they probably still exist and still are taught. And that was how So I kind of started both concurrently. I would say perhaps I started fooling around, just trying to hear things by ear off of blues records before I started learning to read. But then very shortly after that, I started learning to actually read music. Now,
you're a very accomplished songwriter. When did you start composing and putting together your own kind of material? Was that later on, was it when you were young?
Oh, right from the beginning. I mean, I started, very badly, just, trying to write songs, I think, probably at age 8. And I'm still trying to get it right, at age 61. So, but I started the whole process right away. Just, okay, wow, what a great thing that you can express yourself in this way and funnel your emotions into this form. And I just started hacking away at it,
Now, I want to get a sense of Los Angeles. I think here in Asia, we don't quite understand what it means to be in quite a big hub of music like LA is. Did you have famous musicians with a stone's throw away? Was it very easy to see great music at a young age?
Well, funny enough, I grew up in an area of Los Angeles called Monterey Park, which is over in the San Gabriel Valley, and it's really in East LA, and now it has become, actually in the ensuing years after myself and my family left, it became really primarily Asian, and now it's kind of best known as being a place where people go for great Asian food, and so I grew up there, and at that time there was quite a vibrant and kinetic music scene in East LA, and there was a lot of different tributaries of music that were gestating in East LA. There were bands like War. War was one that came out of East LA, El Chicano. There was a lot of pop music that was coming out of there, like the Midnighters and there's a whole lot of bands were coming out of that area, and there were a lot of concerts and groupings of bands out in El Monte. And if you look at a history, if you read any history of pop music in Los Angeles, you'll see a whole section on East LA. And so I kind of I was a kid growing up at the hind end of that scene. And so, yeah, there were a lot of players and things happening in the pop scene and rock scene in East LA. And in fact, I ended up from a very early age hanging out at a music store called Johnny Thompson Music, which I think is still there, curiously enough, and has kind of the owner kind of adapted himself to the Asian community there, and he still has this shop. But it was a real hub at that time, and it was one of those types of music stores where you'd walk in and there was photos of everybody you could think of up on the wall with someone from the staff there, and so I ended up hanging out there quite a bit and studied with a number of teachers who were teaching out of that music store as well.
Now, you were going to the community school, and that's the name of the school?
That started just a tiny bit later.
Okay.
That started in I believe it might have been 8th or 9th grade. I started going to, and somehow my mother tracked down the community school. It was at that time it was established in association with USC, and it was actually in a building on the grounds of USC on the campus there, and very kind of really I think it was a building that USC had very little need for, and so these people established the community schools there, and it was a fantastic, life-changing program for me, because it was a way to study music theory, composition, and also take instrumental lessons after school with university professors. So concurrently with having this great teacher who I described in the interview that you were quoting, in my public school, which was just by sheer chance that I came across this guy, this iconoclastic guy. I was also studying with a theory teacher who was teaching for the community schools, Mary Ann Usler, and that being able to go after school and study, she was teaching, I think, out of the Paul Hindemith books, and it was just beyond inspiring and energizing for me, because I really had I actually took very readily to studying music theory. I loved it.
When you were an 8th grader studying Hindemith, were the other kids, were they also digging it, or was it a few kids who were really into music and they were enjoying the class? Well,
we had initially, I remember the first year that I was there, we had a pretty full class, and we were in a classroom with those Wurlitzer classroom pianos, and some of the kids were primarily classically oriented students, and I happened across a guy named Billy Childs at that time. And so Billy and I gravitated together because we were by that time I had been playing bass for a while, and I had discerned that in order to really technically be challenged on bass and go beyond sort of a very fundamental and basic understanding of the instrument, that you know, the most the best place to go for that kind of challenge would be jazz. And so I started listening to jazz and really loving jazz, and gradually, I think very quickly, became obsessed with that world and listening to a lot of great jazz musicians. And Billy, at that time, was sort of in the same position. So we kind of glommed onto each other and started playing together, and also, you know, would sit next to each other in the classes at the community school, and that was the beginning of a very long friendship that continues to this day.
Did you have a private bass instructor at the community school?
I did not.
Would you say you're self-taught on the bass?
No. I had a great bass teacher who actually taught me both bass and some piano.
Are you talking about Herb Mickman?
Herb Mickman, that's right. Yes. And he was a very important teacher for me, and then after that I studied arco and more classically oriented double bass playing with a guy named John Schiavo, who was at that time in the LA Philharmonic, and so I had I've always been very lucky to have amazing teachers.
Did you transcribe bass lines from records? Did your teacher, Herb, give you bass transcriptions to memorize? What was the bread and butter kind of learning that you were doing day in and day out?
Herb didn't give transcriptions, but I certainly copped bass lines all the time. I was working at copying bass lines and solos and all sorts of different things off of records. I didn't really start by transcribing bass lines myself. I started, I believe, with Herb working out of the Carol Kay books, and which had a lot of her own bass lines that she had transcribed, and that was more oriented towards practicing sight reading and practicing reading via working your way through all of her books, which still, I mean, I'm sure those books are still great. I haven't looked at one for quite a few years, but they were really great books for that, you know.
At the age of 16, you've mentioned this story before, you went to see Bill Evans at the Playboy Club. Can you remember that experience and what they were playing, and how did it affect you?
Well, and this again was through Herb Mickman. He took me under his wing and would invite me out. I'm trying to think whether I could even drive at that point. I don't know for sure, but I would go to. He would be playing at various hotels or different places with a little band in a lounge here or there, but playing with very good players. And he'd invite me out, and I'd go out there, and sometimes he would let me sit in, and so I'd get a chance to play with these great piano players. And then as it turned out, one of Herb's oldest friends was Eddie Gomez, who was playing bass with Bill Evans. And Herb also knew Bill a little bit from New York, because Herb had grown up in New York. And so he managed to somehow rig it up with those guys to get me into the Playboy Club when I was 16. And at that time, I think Bill Evans had a contract with the Playboy Club for a number of years, where whenever he came to LA, he would play at the Playboy Club in Century City, which at that time was in Century City. And so I once, I forget exactly how it came about. Probably Herb offered it, and once I experienced going there and being able to hear Bill Evans and Eddie Gomez, and I think a series of different drummers play in this very small jazz club that was inside the Playboy Club. I mean, it was just it was like heaven. I mean, as you can probably imagine, for a 16-year-old to be able that close up watching these guys play, be able to talk to them after their set, and be served Coca-Cola by bunnies. I don't think there's anything a 16-year-old boy would like more.
Musically, did that inspire you to practice hard when you saw people at that level?
Oh God, yeah, and by that time I was going out to jazz clubs in LA too. The Lighthouse was another jazz club where all the name players would come, and I had, somehow insinuated myself into being able to get into these places that were probably over 18 kind of jazz clubs. I just, had befriended the owners via talking to them, and they came to know me as a up and coming musician, and so I was going out, one way or another to hear all of my heroes play, quite a few nights a week.
The tunes you were playing, were they the contemporary jazz tunes of the day, or were they standards? What was the repertoire that you were very familiar with?
I was into, I from very, very early on, I was a musical omnivore, and I loved standards, and I was very consumed with learning standards, learning how to play on standards in that framework. I was listening to, the original compositions that Bill Evans wrote. I was listening to Lee Morgan, Freddie Hubbard, Herbie, Wayne Shorter, all these guys who were of course, Miles, and at the same time, I was listening to what was going on in pop music, and following the thread of those bands that were utilizing blues and other elements to put together their direction, like a band called Canned Heat, which was they were basically playing old style blues and kind of putting a little bit different spin on it, but they eventually did a record with John Lee Hooker, and then so I would listen to these groups that were, and artists that were working in the pop area of things or rock area of things, and then kind of follow the thread to who they had listened to. Listening to the Rolling Stones, that led me to listening to Robert Johnson and every great blues artist that you can think of, and same with the Beatles. I was.
That's right. Paul McCartney was quite a bass player, and did you go back and kind of reevaluate those tunes that you loved as a child?
Oh, absolutely. I studied that. I mean, he was a big teacher and influence on me as a bass player from very early on.
Some interviews he mentioned that he really likes James Jamerson, and was that whole Motown thing also influential on you?
Absolutely. I loved all those records. Absolutely loved them and played along with them, obsessively, and everything from those Motown records to James Brown records to then sort of following the thread towards what was going on then musically, like Van Morrison and I mean all of it. I was completely early soul stuff too. The Memphis soul Memphis Stax records, all Sam and Dave, Junior Walker, all of these kind of tributaries, But I was really quite a big fan of all the music that was coming out of Muscle Shoals early on, and those early Ray Charles and Aretha Franklin records that were being done in New York.
Well, Larry, were you playing upright bass or electric bass or both?
Both.
And were you equally comfortable with both instruments?
Yeah, I was really excited about both instruments, and trying to put as much time in. I say, an equal amount of time on each instrument, trying to develop myself and improve, and also at the same time, putting some time into piano and learning jazz harmony and getting a little bit of a foundation on a lot of different instruments, so that I could understand what the limitations and possibilities were with different instruments.
You started touring as a very popular jazz sideman. You worked with some really big names. Could I ask you about your experiences with some of them? For instance, Freddie Hubbard. Could you talk about working with him?
Yeah, I was at a certain point. I think maybe my first actual road gig where I was traveling some, and in addition to playing locally, was with a guy named Willie Bobo, and Willie was a very well-known timbale player and drummer, and he had a group that was very popular in Los Angeles, especially. But he played all over the place, and so I was starting to play with Willie, and also playing at different clubs just locally with different bands in LA, and eventually Freddie, came and heard me play and had heard about me, I guess, and so I went up to his house and played with him a little bit, and that was that. He hired me. And
what was that audition like?
It was very low key. In fact, it was just myself and him, and he was kind of playing piano, which he was a very good piano player. As far as he knew everything that he could play on trumpet, he could play on piano, and we just messed around a little bit for about a half hour, and I think that you can tell quite. Especially a musician of his caliber and level of intuition, he knew whether you were up to it quite quickly, and so it was really sitting and talking about music, sitting and playing a little bit, and that was it. And then he said, "Okay, here's your air ticket. I'll see you in New York."
Wow. One thing, Larry, a lot of kids, their minds are blown when people tell them that you have to play in different keys and you have to transpose. Was that something that was important for you, to play in different keys and to be good at transposition?
Yeah, it was. I would say that by the time that I was started to play with bands around Los Angeles, I had been making my way through things theory-wise to a degree where I was already fairly comfortable with knowing how harmony worked in conjunction with pop music and jazz, and I mean, because I was studying it in a classical context, and so I was doing harmonic analysis on sections of Beethoven pieces and different classical composers, and so the idea of transposition was something that I was pretty comfortable with from early on.
Now, there's another person I do want to ask you about, and that's Joe Henderson, a wonderful musician. Could you talk about working with Joe?
I worked some with him, and then worked some with him as well in the context of some different things that Freddie was doing, where he had Joe Henderson play, kind of as a part of the band. There's a couple of records, or a series of records, that were recorded live at the Keystone Corner in San Francisco, and on those records, Joe Henderson was the sax player in Freddie's band, and Bobby Hutcherson also was a part of those. And Joe was just an amazing. I think in many ways he was the model of what Freddie was always looking for in a tenor player, and in the same way that Tony Williams was his model of what he was always looking for in a drummer, and Herbie was always his model of what he was looking for in a piano player, and these guys, Freddie had really come of age in New York City playing with these guys, and so he, that was the level that he loved playing at. And so, people like myself were both blessed and cursed by the fact that he was hiring young people and trying to bring you up to that level, and trying to get you to play up at that level. And that, for me, was a wonderful thing. For for a lot of horn players and drummers with him, it was harder, especially drummers, because he wanted to hear that kind of elasticity and precision braided together that you hear when you'd hear Tony Williams playing with Miles. And so Joe Henderson, getting back to what your question was, Joe Henderson was really, he aside from Wayne Shorter, he was the person that Freddie thought of as the epitome of what a great saxophone player was.
Now, Larry, you're a wonderful bass player yourself. When you were playing actively at that time, were you consciously trying to make an individual sound, or did you have a hero that you were modeling after?
I think that I was certainly influenced by a lot of great bass players, a multitude of them. I think that one of my big heroes was Eddie Gomez, and so at that time, I really aspired to be able to play melodically in a contrapuntal type of manner, in the same way that Eddie played with Bill. And that was something that I was really working at and trying to develop the ability to do that. But then on the other hand, I loved Ron Carter's playing and listened a ton to him. I loved more traditional players like Ray Brown and Sam Jones and these kind of guys who played really in a more foundational, traditional manner. But that was not as much of what I was looking. I really loved the ability for bass lines to rise up out of the bottom of things and be melodic, provide melodic commentary as well as providing a foundational kind of context for things. And that's one of the things that's one of the reasons why I was so struck by Paul McCartney's bass playing, for instance, because to me, in the context of pop music, he was kind of doing what Eddie Gomez was doing except what he was playing off of the vocal, and in addition to keeping things solid and rocking on the bottom, he was rising up and playing contrapuntally in a way of providing commentary to the vocal, and to this day, that is what I consider to be really good bass playing in a pop, rock, or soul kind of context, that you are providing impetus on the bottom, but you're also assimilating what's going on vocally, and the vocal is guiding you as much as the pulse and the groove.
From a writing and production standpoint, and even playing, your knowledge of talking about counterpoint here and working off the melody, is that something that is it a gift? Is it something you've developed from your vast knowledge of listening over the many years? Or is it something that you intellectually develop with species counterpoint, or just, counterpoint, the theoretical art?
Oh no! I when I use that term counterpoint, I'm not speaking of counterpoint in the sense that it's taught in a classical context.
Do you think they're not related?
Oh no! I do think that they are related, but I guess the study of counterpoint in a classical context, while I certainly think that it's a valuable asset to study, fugal movement and all of the various types of counterpoint that exist in classical music of different eras. I never was really able to directly apply that in a compositional context to pop music. I think perhaps in the way that everything you do and hear affects who you are as a musician, it probably did have an effect on me. But I think that what I ended up developing in my own playing was more of an intuitive nature in some respects. And it's actually an interesting thing that you're bringing up, because I've never really stopped and tried to analyze the nature of exactly how that intuition is, what it's composed of.
I was hoping you'd have the answer.
Well, no, but that is something that it really triggers a question in my mind of trying to think about that a little bit, and especially since I'm interested in doing more teaching now and passing some things on, whatever I can, on to young producers and musicians and composers but yeah, that the way that the bass functions in a contrapuntal fashion in pop music, whether it's pop, rock, or soul that you're speaking of, is a very interesting thing, and I think that a lot of people pick up the ethos of it and the gist of it from listening to James Jamerson or Paul McCartney or some of the great pop bass players, the guys who played on pop records like Joe Osborne. Carol Kay certainly is another one. There are these guys who were playing on the pop top 40 records that you were hearing on the radio at that time in the 60s and early 70s, you know, they really were pioneering this way of having the bass function as another voice that functioned, that was working contrapuntally to what was going on instrumentally simultaneously with the vocal, and that was something. The way that the bass functioned in that way was something that really was fascinating to me, and I just loved it. And so I was listening to, oh God, everything from Carpenter's record to whatever, you know, the Friends of Distinction, all these records by groups that were sort of fabricated groups where perhaps there was a couple of members who played and the rest were studio musicians. And so I you know, simultaneously to pursuing trying to become a jazz musician, I was at the same time really had a very romantic and kind of I was getting a lot of inspiration about the art of being a good studio musician, and so that was, you know, I had all these different areas that were that kind of called to me in a seductive way, and so it was interesting. I mean, it all ended up kind of coming together later, because at a certain point in my development, as I was working within the context of jazz, at a certain point I became kind of, I guess, kind of dissatisfied with being the restrictive nature of that world in some ways, and I moved on and decided, okay, I really want to pursue being a studio musician in Los Angeles. I was tired of being on the road so much, and also I reached a point where I had just gotten a bit fed up with the preoccupation with acrobatic virtuosity in jazz, and I just felt like there were more interesting things going on at that time in pop music. So it's interesting, though, the seeds of all that were there from the very beginning, because I was, you know, when I was living with my parents, I was playing along with the radio and listening to the bass lines on Motown records.
We're tiptoeing very nicely into our next topic, which is music education. Can I read something that you've said? Let me quote you here. Everything in our world now is so abbreviated, moving at such an incredibly fast rate, people forget that apprenticeship and studying and focusing on the basic building blocks of playing and writing music are so important. Let's jump off from there. It's different now, and actually in some ways, it seemed like even though the older generation had less, they had more fire to learn, and they really took their time. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that young people in the world today are in a very difficult situation in developing themselves, in developing themselves musically, in that there is so much competing for your attention in the world now, and of course, I mean, if you look at what it was like in being a young person in the time that I was developing, well, say the 60s and into the 70s, you know, that time was very challenging compared to the previous era, you know, of people in the 50s or 40s and so on and so forth. You can go back and back. But now, I mean, you know, you look at the possibilities and whether it's video games, 500 cable channels, having access to every TV show, movie, at any time of the day or night. Any book, there's such a plethora of distractions that abound that I think a certain kind of focus is difficult for young people to achieve, because there are so many things trying to claim their attention, and I think as a musician or a songwriter or an artist of any type, whether it's pop or jazz or any context, I think that there is a context there that says, from a very early juncture, you can do anything you decide you want to do, and you can make your own record in your bedroom. You can put out your own record and market it on the internet. You can, you have unlimited potential, right? And I think that while that's in some ways is a wonderful thing, that all those gates are open to people who are looking to do something musically or in any of the arts. At the same time, it leads to, in my opinion, people not taking the time to work at developing what they're doing before they jump into trying to build their numbers up on social media and develop a career in a more overt sense. I think that consequentially you have all sorts of strange permutations happening of people who are somehow living in a type of bubble where they think, well, I've spent a year or two studying my instrument, and I know how to play, these chords, and I know what I want to say with my poetry, and so I'm ready to do it. and they make records, they make their own records, and then they put them out, and then they can, depending on the configuration of the bubble that they build for themselves, they can even think that they have a career because they're selling 50 records in Malaysia, and they have some streaming numbers in one part of Alaska, So I just think that while that's an extreme case that I'm citing there, I think that you see a lot of people trying to jump into making their own records and developing their own kind of career before they really have a handle on what would be an interesting and new thing that they could do to enter the game and enter the act of making their own art.
Let me ask you a question that may seem silly, but I think somebody of your stature would have a lot of credibility behind the answer. Can songwriting and composition, can that be taught, or is that something that's a gift that's inbuilt, and you, as the producer or a teacher, is that something you bring out of the student?
I think that it can be taught by really inspired teachers who really know how to do it themselves. And that's where you find, I think there are probably a dearth of those around. I think one of the things that in trying to give advice to young people who are coming up, that I always say is find great teachers. Don't settle for something that's not not great on that front. I mean, of course, if you go to a school, you're going to have some great teachers, hopefully, and some teachers that are not as inspired or as good at teaching. But there are some people who are really great at what they do and who are very inspired and genuine. They have a genuine passion for teaching and inspired in the way that they are able to impart knowledge. And I think that while it's a relatively new idea in a sense, that you can learn some of these things from teachers. I'll just cite one kind of example of my own skepticism in this regard. I mean, I think for years I was a bit skeptical about places like Berkeley, for example, because I thought, well, why do you have to go to a school to learn how to play jazz or to learn how to play pop music, or why can't you just sit at home and listen to records and do do it the way that people always have, by just assimilating all of the great stuff that has come before and putting that into the pot of your own mind and pursuing it in that way. And having gone there now a number of weeks ago and spent some time there doing master classes and teaching some, it really turned my head around in that respect, in that I realized that that one thing that going to a place like that provides you with, aside from the fact that there's some great teachers there, and is that it provides you with a community of students to draw from in order to pursue what you're doing, and that's it. I mean, and it's such a great and such a big community there now. You go there. And I know that you went there, and I, I'm sure it must have been a revelation when you got there, right? Like to come across literally hundreds of different people that you could draw from to collaborate with.
It's eye-opening, although I will say that I really do, your original skepticism is well-founded, I do believe, because in the way that you said, it's the way that everybody has done it in history. There's something to be said for that, I think, and I think that as well is a very valid viewpoint too.
Yeah, I do think so. I think that sort of both things are true. I think that it's probably easy to go to a school like that and to really not get the core of what you need from it, unless you're lucky enough to sort of navigate your way through to the right people as teachers and as collaborators. Or also in the context of a place like that, I think that someone who is a developing musician inevitably they have to have a rabid sense of curiosity themselves as far as what they're listening to, in order to really develop their own voice in that context. So I think you're right that both points of view are valid, but I guess I was very happy to see that my skepticism was a bit I don't know, that there were a lot of good things about these types of schools, because I think on the outside, one thing that concerns me about the whole structure of things in that respect is that all of these, hundreds and thousands of young people are being turned out by these schools and thrust into the act of trying to survive and where to go, how to function in the music business and community out in the world, and that's an issue. I think that the schools are graduating all these people out and putting them out and saying good luck, and
they can be very expensive at the same time.
Very expensive, and once they're out there in the world, okay, how are you going to make this work when even people who are well insinuated and into the flow of things are trying to figure out the same question? How are you going to break in to something that is trying to figure itself out?
I really love what you say about apprenticeship, and I think that can be an incredibly rewarding way of going into the industry. If you have somebody who's really worked in the industry and you're able to be an apprentice, I think that's really a great model.
I agree with you, and I think that I think that a problem in that regard, though, is that, well, one problem I'll just set up as a challenge, I guess it is that in the era that I came up, once I decided that I really wanted to learn how to use the studio as an instrument and learn how to the actual how to make great records and how to structure them and how to work with musical architecture in pop music. At that time, there were so many great studios that were in big cities, and so many of those have closed because of the advent of Pro Tools and how portable the act of making music is now, or making records. And so it used to be really that those places were hives of activity and places where you could encounter other people who you would learn things from and whatnot, but also for engineers and aspiring producers or engineers, especially for engineers, it was a place where you could apprentice, right? Whether it's and the system was such that you start as a runner and you'd work as a runner for 1 or 2 years, and then you'd graduate into being an assistant, and then you'd work an apprentice as an assistant engineer with great engineers. You were able to watch what they did and learn from them, and eventually you'd get an opportunity to engineer. Well, there's very few of those opportunities out there now, especially for young people who have already taken the time to pass through the music school system, because by the time they get out of there, they've got a loan probably that they have to pay off, and they can't afford to, unless they have some other means, that they can't afford to function as a runner in a studio, even if they're lucky enough to find a position, which there are very few of. So there are some real challenges that are out there related to this whole thing, and at the same time, the same kind of dearth of positions of apprenticeship are present in the jazz world, where you used to have these bands like whether it was Freddie's band, Freddie Hubbard, or Art Blakey, Lee Morgan, Stanley Turrentine, all these great artists of that era were they were institutionalized. Like Art Blakey's band, for example, was an institution as a training ground for great young musicians, and so for the leader, it would provide a means of being able to get an affordable band to travel with, and for those lucky musicians, they got a chance to learn by being up on the bandstand and playing, and so there's not so much of that available to aspiring jazz musicians now.
So Larry, I want to end off with a question that's almost now a reverse of what we've been talking about. We've been talking about kids who are enthusiastic and are lacking opportunities. But now I'd like to ask the opposite, because the vast majority of the time in most cities, parents want their kids to take music lessons, but oftentimes there's a lot of distractions, and kids, there's video games, there's TV, there's so many things to distract a kid. How do you instill the fire and the passion of a love for something like music into a child?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that to some degree you can't actually instill that fire. I'll tell you what. I have an experiment in progress on this. I have a 10-year-old boy. My wife and I have a 10-year-old boy, and we made it a non-negotiable issue that he had to study piano and music theory up until he is 18. And so that from the beginning, from when we started him with early education stuff at 5. And so that's just been a non-negotiable issue. And he has at times really railed against it. And as you can imagine, he said, well, I don't want to do this. I don't want to practice. I'm not going to be a musician like you, and these kind of comments. And my answer has always been, well, I'm not saying that you do have to be a musician like me. In fact, I would be in some ways very happy that if you didn't become a musician like me. But at the same time, what I do know is that if you don't do this, you're going to regret it later. And so this is something that we have established as a unnegotiable issue. And so now in his case, he has progressed through a number of years of doing this, and I don't know. He definitely has a passion for music, but at the moment, that music is more hip hop and rap oriented that he has a passion for. But we, through a circuitous series of events, we just came upon a different piano teacher who is a wonderful woman in LA who is in her 80s now and has taught piano and music theory for ages. And in fact, talking about circuitous synchronicity, she also was involved in the community school during the era that I came up, but I never knew her at that time. And so this woman is one of those magical teachers, and he's just taken 2 lessons with this woman, and she has him on fire. And so I've seen firsthand that kind of fire that you're talking about can be instilled by a great teacher. Because for some reason I never would have thought about it in conjunction with my own path, because I just had it when I it from a very early time, and so I had that thing. But I've seen it with my son, where just by the way that she goes about imparting information and talking about playing music, she's lit this thing a bit inside him.
Is she a classical teacher?
She's classically oriented, but wide open in the way that she approaches music. She has a very broad understanding of how music is put together, and she manages to incorporate that into her teaching.
Well, Larry, I hope you come back to update us on the project of your son's musical development. We'd love to hear. Okay. Larry Klein, thank you for being on the show.
Okay, thank you, Nikhil, and I look forward to maybe we can actually speak ourselves, and look forward to finding out a little more about you as well.
Hope to have you on again, and it's what a great honor for us to have you. Thanks so much, Larry.
Okay, thank you.